hierarchy has always existed in nature. There's a leader of each pack, elders to every tribe, and conquerors in every battle. It may be for this reason that mankind has always had rulers overseeing the functions and development of civilization. It may be that this is what nature intended for society, to grow at a healthy, controlled pace without collapsing. Or it may be that man is not yet ready to govern himself. Throughout the ages, tyrants have risen and fallen. Governments have been established and overthrown, like monuments erected and torn down over centuries past. The intentions of these leaders have ranged from nefarious to heroic. Yet, even as humanity has reached the height of its intellect and abundance, the commitment to a system of guided leadership remains central to the entire world system. Many in the modern world are pushing for a more centralized authority, while others fear it will bring the downfall of modern man. Is it still survival of the fittest? Or do the best legislative solutions truly win out in the modern world? No matter how you look at it, there's no ignoring the monumental conspiracies that happen at the top of it all, like they always have. Has our world always needed guidance from learned elders and divinely selected kings? Or has the struggle for power always been won by those willing and able to dominate their opponents? At the beginning of it all, primitive man was up against the elements and environmental dangers of his world. For this reason, those with life experience usually rose to places of leadership within the tribe. These elders did everything from teaching survival skills to keeping an oral history of the stories and traditions of their people. These figures were often the matriarchs of the group who made the major decisions and shouldered the responsibility for the tribe's well-being. Not only did they make political decisions, but they shaped religious ideologies and practices as well. Shamanic rites and rituals became a universal way for young tribe members to take part in the collective identity and enter adulthood. It could be that this is how early leaders imposed subtle control over the collective hierarchy. Though many anthropologists believe that this phenomenon was developed to create a strong generational bond between initiates, which would ensure their cooperation and the future well-being of the tribe. In today's world, everyday life has become an entire system of these rites of passage, from birth and birthdays to graduation, to marriage, to retirement. The ordeals initiates would encounter are still present in college hazing ceremonies today. Did these processes survive by chance? By the design of those overseeing the development of society? Or is it simply an inevitable outcome of the ever-present cycle of life every individual encounters? This is one of the great mysteries of human existence, but there is no doubt that leaders and rulers throughout history have leveraged these communal ceremonies to shape the identities of the masses. Religious fundamentalism is one of the most consistent examples of how powerful the influence of this collective trace can truly be. But was it all mere hypnosis to begin with? Did these primitive ancestors know the best way to manage a group? Or would their way of life crumble in the complexity of the modern world? After the birth of agriculture, tribes gained the capacity to grow beyond small communities into large villages, and the traditional role of a few central elders eventually diminished. Survival was easier to facilitate through commerce and the ability to form larger armies for protection. Scarcity still existed, but not like it did in more primitive hunting and gathering times. It was in this environment that the control of resources and the rules that governed society were entirely determined by force. The leaders of conquering armies were often appointed as leaders. These leaders were often seen as ordained by supernatural forces because many of our ancestors believed it was favor with the gods that gave them victory in battle. This concept of the divine right of kings has preserved royal bloodlines throughout the course of history. In these early times, the kings maintained power over the growing populace by delegating responsibilities through the feudal system. The dukes and lords who had won favor with the king gained authority over certain regions and resources to serve the larger central agenda of the kingdom while enforcing the king's laws. This led to the lower class of peasants revolting on several occasions due to their status of constant oppression in society. Though it may be unlikely that royal families were actually blessed by the gods, the central role of religions in medieval society served to support this narrative, and those who questioned this sacred authority were often put to death in public. Though royal families still exist today, it is in a mostly symbolic role at the head of the state in developed countries. In their time, kings had the ability to rule with impunity, and this is what ultimately led to their downfall. The American Revolution was one of the last nails in the coffin for world superpowers being ruled by kings. The idea that republics and democracies could be established was popularized in ancient Rome and Greece, but it was the Americans who used this model to decentralize power as the world had never seen before. Is it possible that God selected the men most fit to be rulers at some point in the ancient world? Or have the bloodlines of those in power been maintained by the bloodshed of their enemies alone? These monarchies were the earliest recorded form of governments, tracing back to ancient Babylonian and Egyptian cultures. Society slowly grew away from this as time went on, and the masses grew harder to control. The tradition of appointing a single figurehead at the top of governments still exists today, whether it is the chancellor, president, or prime minister. The phenomenon of dictatorships only tended to arise out of necessity in most nations after the time of monarchies. The political party system was heavily refined in the formation of the early American government. The Federalist and Anti-Federalist evolved into Democratic and Republican parties. The success of this system ultimately led to its adoption through Europe and other parts of the world. Since then, some form of democracy or republic has been the premier form of leadership in powerful countries throughout the world. But was government really the byproduct of social progress? Or was the appearance of equality necessary for empires to control larger groups of slaves? Many conspiracy theorists believe that our governments are not controlled by votes and public opinion, but instead backroom deals and shady alliances are used to shape the modern world. For evidence of this, one needs to look no further than the many groups and secret societies that have a hand in government dealings. The Freemasons have been at the core of American government since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Many founding fathers, including George Washington himself, were Masonic initiates. Today, we see even more prolific groups of elite international influence. The Bilderberg Group and Trilateral Commission are both comprised of major heads of state and military throughout the world. Are these leaders protecting their country's interests at these meetings? Or have alliances with other intentions begun to take shape? It may be that power has always stayed under the control of a select few behind the scenes. Was government the only solution to the problems of the growing masses? Or was this proliferation of power simply a tool used by the ruling few to create the illusion of choice? Part 2. Mythology. Some of the world leaders were head and shoulders better than the rest. Of all the great conquests in world history, some stand out due to their notorious leaders. Is it merely great individuals who possess the ability to lead nations, or do these icons get more credit than they deserve? Conspiracy theorists say some historical leaders like Genghis Khan never even existed. Why is it that these characters go down in history like members of their own elite pantheon? Alexander the Great is a prime example of one of these prolific rulers. Alexander III was king of Macedon. His military conquest of Asia and Africa was bloody and legendary. By the age of 30, he had conquered more of the world than almost anyone else before him. Was he born a great military leader on his own? Or are men like this made by the minds of others? In the case of Alexander, one of the greatest minds in the ancient world stood behind much of his success. Aristotle tutored him from an early age to help him master the skills of logic, which are indispensable in warfare. His ability to apprehend the valuable resources and tactics of the armies he conquered made him unbeatable in his time. The strategies he developed are still taught today among military schools around the world. But is it possible that there was more to his success than higher reasoning capacity? Some historians point out that parts of his legacy could have been fabricated, due to the fact that no historians in his own time ever wrote about him, and the ones that did lived hundreds of years later. The idea of a supreme conqueror could be a myth invented by the ruling class, much like the divine right of kings. Napoleon Bonaparte is another military leader credited with conquering a large part of the world. The Frenchman began his success around the time of the French Revolution. He ultimately became the Emperor of France and ruled over most of Europe until 1815. Napoleon was part of the Jacobin movement during the French Revolution. Is it possible that this notorious group installed Napoleon into power? Conspiracy theorists loyal to the crown accused the Bavarian Illuminati of infiltrating their country via the Jacobins to start the revolution. Some even say revolutionary writer Voltaire was a member. It's hard to verify this information, but it's possible that Napoleon himself was serving a much larger agenda. Famous images of Napoleon depict him holding his hand in his suit coat. Was he trying to signal the hidden hand of power held by a secret society that helped him conquer Europe? We may never know. Are great and powerful leaders born with cold-blooded instincts, or are they made by a relentless will to power, forged by the insane pressures of the world around them? Many other iconic leaders like Hitler, Stalin, and Mao were remembered for committing unspeakable atrocities. Between them, the deaths of hundreds of millions of civilians were left behind in their paths to power. Though that seems like an extremely large number, the truth is that governments kill millions of innocent people every year to accomplish objectives. The early American genocide of Native Americans, known as the Trail of Tears, is just one example of government-sanctioned slaughter in American history. It's really hard to know for sure just how many people have died, so that governments could be formed, or so that they could maintain power and expand influence. It is currently estimated that drone strikes in the Middle East kill innocent civilians within proximity of targets as much as 60% of the time, all to get one or two terrorists a little more conveniently. Is this sort of indiscriminate attack justified in times of war, especially when the threat is in a foreign land? Military casualties are only a small part of the atrocities governments commit, as many legislate death against their own people due to problems like overpopulation or states being dominated by brutal religious laws. The average citizen is well aware of these injustices, yet they still vote for politicians and support the military without question. Are the people to blame for the ongoing violence, corruption, and death they permit governments to carry out? After all, a population of sheep begets wolves for rulers. Has the violence and corruption of governments ever been justified? Or is it the inevitable outcome of man's inability to develop rational and ethical solutions to his problems? Not all who see this misuse of power choose to stay silent. The existence of dissenters and outlaws has always caused issues for governments seeking to have their way at all costs. Historically, when laws become unjust and statesmen become hypocrites, it was the outlaws who were considered the heroes of their time. Whether it's the alchemists who fought religious oppression during the Middle Ages or the hacktivists of modern times, there have always been people who choose to walk along the thin line of doing what is right, no matter what the consequences are. Before the modern era of dissent, brilliant minds often resorted to criminal activity, such as bank robbery during the Prohibition era. Even then, characters like John Dillinger were respected as much as they were feared by the public. As time went on and technology progressed, stealing from banks became less feasible and less practical for those standing up against oppressive governments. Stealing incriminating information has become a much more important strategy for those who believe the public is being wronged. Though there have been government watchdog networks for a long time, only recently has leaked information got out in such a profound political capacity. Though money isn't stolen, the punishment for leaking classified government information is much more severe than that of bank robbers. It makes you wonder, what are they really hiding? Edward Snowden found out they were hiding a lot more than we thought when he leaked details about the mass surveillance program going on in the NSA. This cost him his life in Hawaii and his family, but he still chose to put out the truth at great personal risk to himself. If this one man never took that risk, we may have never known the extent of this abuse of power. Does that make this man a true leader? Or is he part of some controlled dissent operation to condition the public for further spying? Since the leaks in June of 2013, state surveillance legislation has only gotten more aggressive through the National Defense Authorization Act and the Cloud Act from the Omnibus Bill of 2018. Can one man ever really make a difference in the modern world? It seems that the control may be too great for any individual to oppose alone. Currently, Snowden is still in exile, with harsh penalties awaiting him should he return to his home country of the United States. Were outlaws simply bad seeds, destined to live lives of crime? Or were these men truly brave heroes, whose memory has been preserved by history in spite of their persecution? When enough people have had enough, that's when things usually begin to change. Though there have been hundreds of revolutions throughout history, it's hard to tell if mankind has become any more free than before they happened. Like the American and French revolutions, shadowy groups are behind almost every major revolution we see. Though things appear organic in the media, you can always follow the money to see who is really behind these insurrections. In modern times, we see that the groups who appear around the beginning of revolutions are well funded and equipped to cause social unrest. Many speculate that it has always been this way. The only difference now is that the funding is more transparent. The Occupy movement and Black Lives Matter are two major social activist groups who've gotten a lot of attention in the last decade. It turns out that both of these groups were funded by a man named George Soros. Soros has been actively involved in funding many counterculture groups, many with radical agendas. Conspiracy theorists point to this one individual as a major force of civil unrest in the world. Did characters like this exist in the past? It is no secret that many American special interests were involved in World War II. Henry Ford provided the Nazis with major manufacturing power. Even at the time of the Civil War, the conflict was actually based on Northern interests bent on controlling the cotton industry, even though we are told the conflict was about the emancipation of slaves. Revolutions always come disguised as much-needed civil rights changes, when in most cases they serve the broader financial interests of those in the ruling class. Small uprisings for the greater good happen in local governments and other minor capacities. Just remember, anytime we see a major televised social movement, chances are it's just another rich man's game. Have revolutions brought mankind closer to the highest degree of freedom, or have they always been carefully designed exchanges of power, paid for with the blood of the people? Part 3. Legacy. In today's world, there's one major dichotomy underlying the entire political landscape. This is the question of whether a government should be further centralized or decentralized. What is most interesting about this dichotomy is the hypocrisy on both sides of the argument. Older generations tend to lean toward decentralization and economic freedom when they are the very beneficiaries of the central redistribution of wealth through systems like Medicaid and Social Security. Younger generations are predominantly calling for a more central and socialized form of government, even though they say it is a lack of opportunity that causes the need. Not to mention, they have been the beneficiaries of technologies and services built to counter heavily regulated industries. This single question, paired with the average person's growing distrust of the political system, has created a polarizing and hostile political environment that may lead to some new revolution. Radical political groups are highly active in major countries again for the first time since the 1960s and early 70s. Not only has centralization been at the center of this conflict on a domestic scale, but on an international scale. Due to the major rise in populism in the West, radical nationalist groups have risen to meet the growing force of socialist groups like Antifa. Two opposing sides who refuse to recognize the legitimacy of an existing authority is usually the first major indicator that a revolution is already underway. It's no surprise that both of these groups are heavily funded by forces that aim to benefit off of the conflict, like other revolutions. Many conspiracy theorists believe that these powers are attempting a controlled demolition of the long-standing American empire. They believe it will be replaced by some monolithic form of global government. It's hard to predict which way things will go, but the threat of revolution is very real. Globalization is an inevitable process with the advent of the information age. But are nations better off as sovereign? Or are larger solutions needed to meet the demands of the connected world? The threat of terrorism is enhanced in this new global landscape. But does that mean that domestic security systems need to be interlaced into a central unit of command to fight this problem? Many countries in the world still have competing interests due to the nature of the economy. Can these differences be reconciled to serve one global interest? Or is this idea out of touch with the realities of the economic condition of our world? Is more control by the leaders really the answer to our world's current issues? Are coalitions like the UN and EU good for the fully globalized world? Or do competing interests further complicate the situation? Many today believe that it is the system of government itself which causes the problems we face today. The concept that an individual man should be sovereign with inalienable rights traces all the way back to the early European Enlightenment period. This concept became further refined due to the evolution of philosophy and economic theory over the next few hundred years. The first self-proclaimed anarchist was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon around the first European Socialist Revolution of 1848. He wrote the following in an essay in 1851, titled "The General Idea of the Revolution." To be governed is to be watched, inspected, spied upon, directed, law-driven, numbered, regulated, enrolled, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, checked, estimated, valued, censured, commanded by creatures who have neither the right, nor the wisdom, nor the virtue to do so. To be governed is to be at every operation, at every transaction noted, registered, counted, taxed, stamped, measured, numbered, assessed, licensed, authorized, admonished, prevented, forbidden, reformed, corrected, punished. It is under pretext of public utility and in the name of the general interest to be placed under contribution, drilled, fleeced, exploited, monopolized, extorted from, squeezed, hoaxed, robbed, then, at the slightest resistance, the first word of complaint, to be repressed, fined, vilified, harassed, hunted down, abused, clubbed, disarmed, bound, choked, imprisoned, judged, condemned, shot, deported, sacrificed, sold, betrayed, and to crown all, mocked, ridiculed, derided, outraged, dishonored. That is government. That is its justice. That is its morality. Many early anarchists in Europe had socialist leanings, and that didn't change much until later on. In America, the roots of market anarchism began around the 1840s as well. This form of anarchism was based on the natural integrity of the economy, rather than relying on some form of collective social contract. Lysander Spooner was the first market anarchist, but the idea was championed in modern times by historian and political theorist Murray Rothbard, who combined the ideas of early anarchists with the advanced economic theory developed in the Austrian school of Ludwig von Mises. Today, anarchist sentiments are at an all-time high due to the spread of information about these pioneers and their ideas. Is man destined to govern himself through civil cooperation and simple rules? Or is he doomed to perpetuate conflict based on scarcity, ideology, and the inability to reconcile differences reasonably? The power vacuum that creates governing forces may be due to man's inability to make critical compromises for the practical good. Though there have been small pockets of self-governing societies throughout history, a true anarchist nation has never been seen in the time of our civilization. Do anarchists have a natural right to exercise sovereignty from the state? Or is this gray area too dangerous for the rest of society? Many conspiracy theorists point to some external authority for the world's injustice. Whether it's the UN, the Bilderberg Group, George Soros, or the New World Order, they are convinced that some villain is keeping the world under their control. But is it possible that these same accusers may take part in the blame for the current human condition? Is it even possible that they contribute to the creation of these demiurgic scapegoats unknowingly? Two early philosophers discuss this, and the debate of their ideologies is now legendary. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke came out of a very similar world between the 1600s and 1700s. Like many philosophers, each sought to rationalize and explain the condition of humanity, but more specifically, why we had rulers and what was the place of those rulers in a mature society. They came to a similar conclusion, that authority was a necessary part of the human system to maintain a sustainable civilization. Each man got to this conclusion different ways, and each man defined that ideal authority in very different ways. Hobbes said that man's nature was corrupt and primitive. This original sin type of thinking leads him to the conclusion that man was destined to remain dysfunctional, and that an absolute monarchy was necessary to keep society from collapsing altogether. This means the average person should relinquish their rights to serve society as a whole. Locke didn't feel this was an accurate depiction of the human condition. He viewed man's life as a progressive evolution toward a greater capacity for morality and intellectual self-discipline. This idea spurred major Enlightenment thinking to flourish shortly after his time. Locke said that authority should play a limited role in the world. He said that by leaders protecting liberty and property, society would have the proper conditions to grow harmoniously. Without protecting those essential elements, he believed barbarism would ensue. The interesting similarity between these men is that both realized that civilization was a fragile endeavor. Can man overcome his primitive urges given the correct circumstances? The long-standing development of commerce in countries with a strong republic or democracy seems to indicate that it could be possible, though it is also important to note that some of this development came from less humane means. Imperialism, exploitation, and war are also a huge part of the equation. Could man see this kind of development in the world of minimal government envisioned by Locke? Or do major systems and economies always need to be regulated to attain healthy growth? Even if it could, do the powers that be stand to lose too much if it did? Will mankind ever become mature enough to manage its own chaos? Or will there always be central checks and balances to keep an equilibrium and status quo? The government has always been systematic in nature, but with so much legislation, how do they keep track of it all? Enforcing laws, auditing taxes, keeping track of votes accurately, and the list goes on. Can technology provide the framework to make government more efficient? Or is this something humans must keep a close watch over? Electronic machines have proven to be susceptible to tampering with votes. Setting up cameras for law enforcement is a violation of the Fourth Constitutional Amendment. And who is to say that taxes couldn't be hacked too? Though technology has made our lives more convenient, what is its place in our government? The advent of blockchain technology may help solve some of these problems and create more transparency in government than we've ever seen before. The blockchain software system, which is used to create alternate monetary systems like Bitcoin, has unique characteristics which could fight government corruption at an unprecedented level. The blockchain is a ledger or digital record of all transactions or data in a given database, which is stored on a decentralized network and is accessible to anyone. So what does this mean? This means everything the government does could be recorded in detail and stored on a database where all tampering would be seen by everyone monitoring the system. This creates complete accountability for every party accessing the system and ensures that corruption would be detected immediately. Could a technology such as this ever be implemented on such a massive scale? Government is already so complex. Is it possible that this software could automate and simplify its duties in an ethical and transparent way? Many activists and skeptics are currently debating this topic, and even though the technology is highly advanced, it is not infallible. The special interests controlling governments around the world may be terrified of this technology, tracking campaign contributions and other maneuvers. But soon the demand for a better system may force them to accept it and try to capitalize on it how they can. Some believe blockchain-based cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are actually invented by the powers that be to move toward a cashless society where everyone's transactions can be policed and taxed grossly by future legislation. It's hard to know which way it will go for sure, but there is no denying that technology like this will shape our future one way or the other. This could be used to create a stateless system of software-based accountability between individuals. Or it could rein in an Orwellian technocracy that the world has never seen before. Will we live in a world that is ruled by machines in the future? Or do we already? Can humanity use technology to emancipate himself from governments and rulers? Or will he choose a dystopian police state scenario instead? Was humanity destined to be enslaved by the powers that be forever? Or are we living just before the dawn of a truly free society? Decide for yourself. This is only the official story.